What we'd like to do is take some of the richness from your smaller groups and bring it to the larger group. So we're looking to you for any questions you'd like to raise. You can ask a specific question of one of our panelists, or a more general question, any comments coming out of your conversation at the table. What would you like to add to this discussion about the state of the field? What would you like to have more discussion on? So we're looking for folks to raise their hands. Again, when you get the mic, please say your name and your affiliation and let us know what you would like to ask or say. Can you stand up?
Thank you, Tim. So I'm Chris Benet, but I'm just talking on the behalf of the table here. I think we heard some very exciting talk this morning from three major, actually probably four major actors around resilience. And we were wondering whether, and we would like to hear from those panelists, whether there's some formal mechanisms through which USAID can learn from what DFED is doing in terms of resilience measurement, or the EU is learning what DFED is doing beyond just the one-to-one, face-to-face interaction that I can have with that guy from USAID from DFED, because I've been working with them before. So is there some formal mechanisms through which we could really build up on each of the big actors in terms of learning about resilience?
Who might want to speak to that from our panelists? Greg?
I definitely won't speak on behalf of all the panelists, but I do think it's a good question. And I think we've done a lot of internal navel gazing in USAID over the last 5 years, trying to get USAID to work with itself, as I described, and that's been a heavy, heavy lift. But I do think we're mature enough in the work on resilience measurement, resilience evidence, the stuff that Stefan's done with Unbreakable, the stuff that we're doing with U2 and a bunch of others. Certainly, we're beginning to partner more with DFID and Imogen on research on value for money and some of the stuff that Courtney's done. But you're right, right now it's an informal network predicated on goodwill and individual relationships. So I second the notion that somehow some structured, formal process of bringing that information together. I don't think it's just donors as well. I know that FAO has a big learning platform on resilience and resilience measurement. So there are some opportunities around particular topic areas. I think one that I'm aware of is something called the Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement that a couple of folks in the back table there, Luca, Marco, and Mark Consis are involved in, as well as some others. But having that be not just an informal sharing, but actually have a venue to bring these materials together would be really, really good. Because I think we're all moving together, but we may not be seeing each other's learnings, and we could be learning faster and moving more quickly. And I would just throw the sort of challenge to all of us. You know, it's great that we're able to model out the value for money, but one of the big challenges for us in the next 12 months, probably shorter time frame, is to actually capture what humanitarian assistance needs are being averted through this work, and to do it in real time, as Stefan said, for the good of doing that, but also as a marketing tool for making sure we have the resources to do this work. So any other panelists? Renate, Imogen, where's?
At first, when I heard the question, I thought, that's a very easy one for us. Because as I said, when I was sitting there on stage, the EU is not necessarily a knowledge organization, so we depend on others that do the knowledge work. We were simply not equipped with doing that. But then I thought, no, there's more to it. On the one hand, I presented this pilot exercise that we are now launching with our member states to bring the humanitarian and development actors together in a couple of pilot countries, where we will build on the expertise of our member states in this process. It's not formalized in the sense of a regulation, But it's a process to which then those member states have volunteered to go in together with us. So this is one base. The other one is that I would like to mention is we are having, what is it? It's a term that the World Bank uses. They call it deep dive. It's a kind of process and dialogue with a few key strategic partners. And we have had our first dialogue, and it's a process, follow-up process. 2016 with the World Bank with President Jim Kim, and by then time, Vice President of the European Commission, Kristalina Georgieva, meanwhile CEO of the World Bank. And that was about fragility, conflict, violence. So this is very close to what we are discussing today, and that was again to learn from each other. So there is a follow-up process with an action plan, with a couple of things that we are doing together, hoping that through this action plan, this will become a structured and natural way of collaborating of services. And where we are probably stronger as EU than a body like the World Bank, where also the UN system would be stronger than the World Bank, is helping the World Bank where they are restricted by the mandate that they are doing in terms of doing knowledge and research work. This is more on the, when we look at resilience, not the disaster, food security, flood, earthquake kind of resilience, but more on the conflict side of resilience, where we are probably having another approach of doing analysis. I think there we can mutually reinforce each other. But this is just more now as an idea. I just wanted to flag a few things which are kind of taking place in a kind of structured way, but not overall.
Thank you.
I'll just be quick. So,
Can you put the mic up?
yeah. So I agree. It's really important. I mean, we've spent a lot of time, each of us, doing our own work, and we do need to join it. Well, so I think that's one forum. I don't know if everybody who needs to be in it is in it. There's a challenge around even once we've got a more common measurement to actually how we apply that in practice, but that's probably something the working group will need to be grappling with. But I agree, as a general principle, I agree we need to be all working harder to try and consolidate some of the relationships we have into more general practices and groups.
Thank you, Stefan.
I was very happy to learn about these events for that exact reason, that I don't think we have like a platform to do that regularly. So it's great that you have done it. Maybe you want to do it regularly, I don't know. I let that for you to decide. I just wanted to flag two little things. One is, so JFDR has this twice a year consultative group meetings with donors and recipient countries where we have some of that exchange taking place. It doesn't include everybody, but we really find this extremely useful, so more of that clearly would be good. And I just wanted to flag one thing which I think is a good example. When there is a plane accident anywhere, you have like an analysis of the reasons, and lesson learned are sent back to all of the airlines and all of the regulators of the airline industry. And I've never really understand why we don't have similar, like very formal learning processes when something wrong or right happens somewhere. But I think we could also think about more formal way of sharing this knowledge we have.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Okay.
Absolutely, you may respond as well.
Okay.
Wait for the mic and your name.
Just a quick note that the OECD has a risk and resilience experts email network, and they meet about once a year, and obviously donors can be a part of that as well as NGOs and others. So that might be a useful forum. I think it's mostly used for information sharing. It's not really for debate, but I think it's a structure that could be built on.
Great. Thank you.
My name is Amadou Njade. I'm from USAID Niger. It was just a follow-on question to the first one. I wanted to understand to what level can we harmonize these different resilience programs? And this is very important for the countries where they are, because when we were starting our resilience program in Niger, we had at least 4 or 5 versions of resilience. and poor countries had to accept them all because they need the money. But basically, we just couldn't make our way out of what each one wanted to achieve. Sometimes the differences are very, very slight, very, at least in the field, you don't see really those very specific differences. So I was just wondering, to what level can these, at least down to what level can we harmonize these approaches to make it easier for the governments where they are being applied?
That's given us the country view. Anybody else want to comment on that particular piece? If not, we'll look for questions or sharing. Please, got a hand up here. I think he's been volunteered.
Good. My question is related to the relationship these organizations of donors have with the governments. Whatever is done to help in these countries, the ultimate responsibility lies with the government, whether it's a corrupt or well-performing government, whatever it is. And I did not see any mention of this relationship with the government. I think here I can talk about the case in Somalia, for example. It's in a conflict area, and the government is very weak, and so many organizations, international organizations, are directly implementing the resilience programs. Government is very, very little. And the argument is that there is no capacity. Now, today we can say there is no capacity, and therefore we can accept that. But if we go the way we're doing, that we plan ourselves, we go and then we implement, the best that has been done right now is sit down with the government and say, we have this project. And the project is already prepackaged, as my colleague was saying, then all we have to do is accept it. But in a real partnership, you need to involve the government as a representative of its own people from day zero. When the concept is born, that's when they should be part of it. I think that will still save those people who do not trust the governments and the integrity is questioned. We're not talking about money here. Here we're talking about we want to develop our own people, and we want to be in the lead of the ideas of developing our own people. That's the question. And that cannot happen if we are not involved from day one. And I think in the case of Somalia and probably in other parts, if capacity an issue of getting the public institutions as part of the partners in the implementation, then I would expect also to be capacity development a priority for resilience in working in those particular areas. So it should figure as a top priority so that we don't end up in a situation where today we say these institutions don't have capacity. We do the work. 5 years later, we still say they don't have the capacity. 15 years later, we say they don't have the capacity. No, I don't have an argument against the integrity. Money is a very sensitive issue. Let's put that. But in terms of people who can engage professionally and competently with these issues, these can be built. These can be developed. Although I hate to use the word build, there's nothing to be built. There's no zero capacity. It's about enhancing the capacity rather than starting from. Even in Somalia, where you have 20 years, 30 years of conflict, we have the capacity. It's about enhancing the existing capacity. So that issue of the relationship with the government, and the other issue that we also talked about here is the time frame. I have no idea what's happening in other countries, but in Somalia, where you have, it's the only country where drought has killed 250,000 people. There's no other place in earth that has happened. So resilience for that country is very important. and look at the projects that we're implementing there. They are one-year projects. How on earth can you think about changing resilience in a country with a time frame of 1 year? The thinking and is not in accordance with the needs that we have. So I think conceptually there's something wrong. If you are satisfied with looking evidence of resilience with that time framework, there's something wrong. There is something wrong. You will never receive a resilience within a year of program. So I think those are the issues that and in a situation like here, where the purpose is to learn, I think that's the big thing. It's a learning process, and if it's a learning process, therefore, I would have expected also the panels to talk about the success, yes, but also the shortcomings. What are we missing? Where did we fail? How can we improve? And I would have expected the panels, and I hope they will touch on this maybe in the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. There is time indeed to hear from panelists. Before you respond, we have a quick follow-up on this side.
Okay, sorry. I'm Don Owino from USAID Kenya and East Africa. I want to respond because I have a different experience in Kenya, for example. He's talked about capacity of the government, and what we have in Kenya is slightly different. You have a government that is very deliberate. It has a common program approach, the ending drought emergencies, and it has, in terms of capacity of coordinating all implementing entities, government, non-government, bilateral institutions, its own departments. All of that are focused on resilience program. So I think it differs from country to country. So yes, and if you look at even in terms of, you say, the mission itself, mission has also invested in trying to strengthen that capacity of the government to coordinate all resilient programs. So I think it's very interesting to look at that. But more on this common approach, the ending drought emergency, I think there's a session tomorrow for that. But I wanted to give that view that to country, some have very strong capacity, and some are still learning, and it's a learning process. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, for a response?
Yeah, I was going to actually point to the case of Kenya as a sort of counterexample, but also just to remind to the very good points my colleague was making. I lived in Garissa in the 1990s. It was not always the case. And there were a couple of things that happened. A pastoralist voice in Parliament, devolution, which is a huge accelerator when resources and decision-making were devolved at county level. We're going to hear a lot about the ending drought emergencies and how our investments align to it. But the one thing of having a country-led plan, 5 forms of resilience in Kenya. There's one, it's called Ending Drought Emergencies Initiative, and everybody's aligning resources and learning behind it. So for me, it's a very personal thing to have been in Garissa in the 1990s and to see the 180 that Kenya has done. And so when I go to a place like Malawi and I'm meeting with the government there, I'm not talking about USAID projects and investments and clever measurement. I'm talking about what the government of Kenya has done, what the government of Ethiopia has done. And as a result of that, Malawi is actually developing and allocating budget against a national resilience strategy based on the Kenya ending drought emergencies. So the influence of these models of country-led are absolutely critical, but I think your points are very much well made.
Do we have other panelists who would like to respond to this one? Stefan?
I think it's maybe the most important question we have, and when I was warning against some quantified indicators, it's also related to this question, because if you have some indicators or assessment methodologies which are like too strict, you don't get any politics in it, you don't get any choices, you don't get any priorities that might differ across countries, so you close the door to any conversation about the local priorities or the local approaches. And we have to be very modest in the sense that in many cases things which were innovative in countries were created in countries might not have fit in any of the very strict indicators or list of activities that we could have developed at the international level. So without this flexibility at the local level, we might miss a lot of this experimentation that then is the basis for the best study and the best lessons that we're using in other places. So it's really important, and I think I'm an economist, and one thing that economists are not doing well is to separate the political objectives from the technique, the assessment, the analysis that they do. And I think this is something that we have to be very careful at, like not let the political choice being like all mixed up with the technique that we're using. One way around that, what we have been using recently is in this approach that we call decision making under uncertainty, for missing a better term. We really start with working on vision, where you can open the door to all of the different beliefs about what's important, all of the different priorities, and so on. And only after this work, which is trying to open all of the doors, has been done, then you can do some economic analysis to just rank projects, look at prioritization and so on. So you get the technique, but after you have discussed the objectives and the priority in political terms. I'm not sure how we can bring that to this evidence work so that we're not forgetting this first segment when we're assessing what is a good practice and what's not. But just to give you an example, we have a lot of work on cities where Singapore is the example that everybody uses. And that it's good urban planning, but I don't think that you take the Singapore way of making decisions and you apply it everywhere and it's great, right? So I'm always like trying to push back to this Singapore model that's used as where everybody should be moving to, because it closes the door to these political questions. So I think that I don't know if there was a group during the day on that, but how to separate the assessment and the value for money and the quantification and the prioritization based on political priorities would be really something to bring in.
Thank you. And Renate has a comment.
Just very quickly, it's a formal thing for our cooperation with the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So whatever happens under the European Development Fund, it requires, it's a true partnership. So it's not that we come with a program because we wouldn't be able to do it, because our rules require that we have a joint thing with the government. So already we need to have two signatures. We cannot just say to you, this is what we offer. It is something that we elaborate together so that you have the ownership into it and are fine with signing it off and then also helping the implementation. This is one element. The other element is definitely about country leadership and things. Somalia might have been difficult at the time. I think its situation is improving. So in terms of leadership, where I think it is good that we have other examples where I would put in the term peer learning, that it is in terms of capacity building, not also between donor and recipient countries, but also between neighboring countries and regional organizations that exist in your region that you have. And there I'm coming, being myself in a supranational entity, which is basically a regional organization, where I think peer learning is much more convincing and listening to what's happening with the neighbor and can I learn from that or not, than somebody coming from the other side of the world telling what would be good for us.
Thank you. Well, please.
Hi, Zarek Smith from USAID Senegal in our Sahel regional office. So we had another question that was raised here at the table. Tom Stahl started our day off talking about how resilience is in large part learning how to manage and deal with shocks by doing development differently. There's also been a couple of speakers who have talked about how humanitarian assistance and development are also part of this this agenda. I guess the thing that we noted was that there seems to be a paucity of our humanitarian assistance colleagues in the room, although I would expect that some of development and humanitarian assistance. And so what we would really like to hear more about, perhaps from the panelists or from others, is what do we know about doing humanitarian assistance differently, because this discussion, at least so far this morning and in much of the discourse that I've been involved in, is about how do we do development differently. So I'm particularly interested in what do we know about the humanitarian assistance enterprise and how that's evolving in a different way to accommodate the resilience knowledge base.
That question is out there. Did you want to respond to that one? Please take the mic. Your name?
Thank you. John Meyer from CARE Ethiopia. And, our discussion touched on a similar point. And we talk about resilience as conceptually kind of bridging this gap between development and humanitarian, but they remain kind of separate streams with separate institutions and government structures, etc. And one of the very subtle narratives out of Ethiopia in the drought of 2015 and 2016 was that because there was a crisis, then resilience programming obviously didn't work, isn't working, and you could see this as people trying to, from the humanitarian side, perhaps trying to solve the problem, or cynically trying to pull resources their way, and we're a little concerned in that regard. So I guess reinforcing this about how the agencies see and bringing the departments together.
Thank you. We have only a little time, so I just want to hear from a couple more folks who wanted to make a comment or raise a question in the back. There's one there, and then I think also the table closer to us.
My name is Katie Downey, and I work for World Vision on a SOMREP project in Somalia. I've also worked in Kenya extensively, and in fact was part of the USAID-funded technical consortium which developed the Ending Drought Emergencies document, and I sat on the committees at NDMA, etc. I've been doing this since about 2011. One of the interesting things about working in Somalia right now is I'm now working on humanitarian projects, and some of the things that we come up against are the problems with donors in terms of the humanitarian funding cycles and the modalities and the development funding cycles, and trying to get those two to coincide, particularly with some of the larger donors. Some donors, such as DFID, have excellent crisis modifier mechanisms, which are being put to use in places like Somalia. Some of the things that we grapple with are reporting to donors on the humanitarian side, looking at how do we quantify the fact that perhaps the beneficiary population has not suffered as much as they would have had we not been there. How do we manifest that? Do we have something called time to recover? Because, for example, when you collect your, say, midline data in the middle of a drought, you haven't seen any change, for example, between baseline and midline. How do you report that to a donor? And it's simply because actually what you should be able to report is that if you hadn't been there, things would have been much worse. That's pretty difficult to find a way to manifest that, given the amount of funding that we have for M&E and given the complexity of M&E for resilience. So I think a lot of what could help is donors understanding the type of funding modality that needs to be appropriate to incorporate different cyclical requirements of humanitarian and response innovation, interventions and development interventions. So sort of a do no harm for the humanitarian to provide the foundation when there is a degree of stability achieved to now enable economic growth to go forward. And I think at present, although we have very good analytics in terms of measuring resilience or measuring populations and significant associations with well-being improvements in some of our interventions, we still very much lack the ability on the ground to monitor our interventions with respect to whether or not they will achieve the type of resilience for the population that we envisage. And I would like to see the theoretical and the practical coming closer together.
Thank you. one more comment or question here, and then we're going to give Imogen the last word here. Brief.
I'm Vijaya from USAID Nepal. Actually, I would like to learn, what factors or tools that motivate collaboration among the projects or donors working for resilience, because I would like to cite an example that I have observed in the fields, because we tend to discuss in the room and in different meetings and events, but when I go to the field and observe what's happening in the field, the organizations, for example, like Mercy Corps, Windrock, Save the Children, because they have their own organizational policies, and so they would like to work on themselves, but what motivates them to collaborate between Windrock and Mercy Corps, Windrock and Save the Children? Yes. So what is it? Just the M&E? Is it the indicators, or beyond that? And how donors are motivating? Are motivating their field offices to collaborate between donors as well, yes, so that the donors and the implementing partners network can motivate the government to take, partner government to take ownership on the resilience work. So I would like to learn the experiences from different countries, how real collaboration happens in the field where resilience results to be seen, Thank you.
Thank you. Imogen, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, there's quite a lot in that. I'm not sure I can speak to all of that. So I hope this isn't actually the last word, and the conversation will carry on over lunch. I did particularly want to talk to the humanitarian and the I think on our side at least, one of the big changes has been longer time frames for humanitarian programming. It's also about saying that crises aren't just a humanitarian problem, and actually all of the sectors and development actors need to be engaged. There has also been a shift in DFID's new humanitarian policy, which isn't fully out yet, so I won't speak to it too much, but it will talk a lot about resilience, and it will talk about things like government ownership and leadership. It'll talk about things like crisis modifiers, although we don't necessarily call it that. But building into development programs and systems the ability to flex and respond, what we call shock responsive. I very much hope that humanitarians aren't making a grab for resources in this. That's not how we see it. The humanitarian budget is incredibly stretched. And the cost seems to keep going up. So there is very much a desire to make sure that although the humanitarian needs are being met, that it's not all coming from a humanitarian budget. It's not all being seen as a humanitarian problem, and actually there are more resources going into resilience than at the moment, because that's in everybody's favour. The question, is it working? It's very dangerous to look at somewhere like East Africa in the last year or two and say, well, because people are still struggling, that means resilience doesn't work. That's not the case. I think it's very difficult to quantify how much worse things would have been had we not been there. It's a counterfactual, and we can't prove it. But at the same time, we can, I think, and we have done through some of the evidence we've gathered, been able to show that actually people are better off because we did something. And I think the case that makes to us is actually we need to do more, because people still aren't as well off as they should be. And even if we've managed to keep people at a level, actually what we're trying to do isn't keep people at a level, it's actually to build people up further. So actually, for us, I think what that means is we need more resource, we need more effort. It is difficult to make that case sometimes to some of our political leaders, because of course they want to see clearer results. So there's a kind of a challenge there for all of us to be really smart about what we can show and the difference that we have made. I think probably somebody else is going to be better placed to speak to how it works in the field. That's not where I am right now, but maybe that's a conversation that can happen over lunch, if that's all right.
And beyond, potentially. Let's take a moment to thank our panelists, and then we'll have a few announcements. We have a hand for our folks. Thank you.